The Empress Wu Zetian thought she understood power when she ruled the Tang dynasty, but the real architects of Chinese civilization's most influential decisions weren't sitting on thrones. They were entertaining in silk-draped chambers that history tried to erase. These weren't just pleasure houses. They were universities of influence, banks of information, and centers of political power that shaped dynasties for over 2,000 years. What they really were will change everything you thought you knew about ancient China. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Forbidden City as Empress Wu Zetian reviewed the reports that would determine the fate of millions across her vast empire. The year was 6095 CE, and China's only female emperor believed she understood every source of power in her domain. She controlled the army, the bureaucracy, the treasury, and the courts. Yet the most crucial decisions shaping her reign weren't being made in her throne room at all. They were unfolding in silk-draped chambers across Chang'an that history would later try to erase from memory. These weren't the crude establishments that Western observers would later dismiss with moralistic disdain. They were sophisticated centers of culture, education, and political influence that operated according to rules more complex than imperial law itself. Within their walls, courtesans, who could recite the complete works of Confucius, debated philosophy with scholars, negotiated trade agreements that would reshape Asian commerce, and gathered intelligence that could topple dynasties or forge peace across continents. The women who presided over these institutions weren't victims of circumstance but architects of influence, who wielded power that most government officials could only dream of possessing. They spoke multiple languages, maintained vast libraries, commissioned works of art that would outlast empires, and preserved cultural traditions that would survive every political upheaval China would face over the next millennium. Lei Shishi, the most famous courtesan of the Song dynasty, maintained a salon where generals planned military campaigns, poets crafted verses that would influence literature for centuries, and merchants arranged trade deals that connected China to markets from Korea to Central Asia. Her establishment functioned as an unofficial university where young men from wealthy families received education in literature, music, politics, and social graces that formal schools couldn't provide. Emperor Huizong himself would disguise himself as a commoner to attend her gatherings, not for the reasons history would suggest, but because her salon offered intellectual stimulation and political insight that his court couldn't match. The discussions that took place in her presence shaped imperial policy more directly than formal council meetings ever did. Yang Guifei, whose beauty was said to have launched 1,000 ships, actually wielded influence through her profound understanding of Central Asian politics and her ability to serve as an unofficial ambassador to the various kingdoms along the Silk Road. Her relationship with Empress Yuanzong wasn't just romantic. It was a political alliance that maintained peace across a region where war could have devastated trade and cultural exchange. But their real power came from something far more dangerous than beauty or even intelligence. They controlled information. In an age before newspapers, telegraph systems, or any form of mass communication, these establishments served as the central nervous system of Chinese civilization, gathering, processing, and distributing knowledge that could determine the fate of millions. Every conversation was carefully remembered, every confidence strategically shared, every secret precisely valued according to its potential to influence events. The courtesans who presided over these institutions weren't just entertainers. They were information brokers, operating sophisticated intelligence networks that spanned continents and influenced decisions from the imperial palace to the remotest trading posts along the Silk Road. The physical architecture of these establishments reflected their true function as centers of power rather than simple pleasure houses. The most sophisticated ones contained libraries that rivaled those of imperial academies, art collections that preserved masterpieces through centuries of political upheaval, and archives that maintained records of commercial, political, and cultural activities that official historians either couldn't or wouldn't document. But the strangest part was how these places operated according to rules more complex than imperial law itself. Chang'an, in 750 CE, was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million inhabitants who had transformed it into a cosmopolitan center, where Persian merchants negotiated with Korean diplomats, where Buddhist monks debated philosophy with Confucian scholars, and where the cultural exchange that would shape Asian civilization for the next 1,000 years was taking place in establishments that official history would later pretend didn't exist. The city's layout itself reflected the sophisticated integration of these institutions into the broader fabric of Chinese society. They weren't relegated to shadowy districts or hidden alleys, but occupied prominent positions along major thoroughfares, their architecture rivaling that of government buildings and religious temples. The most prestigious establishments featured courtyards designed according to principles of feng shui that were more sophisticated than those used in imperial palaces. The Pinkang Ward, the entertainment district that housed the most influential of these institutions, was laid out like a small city within the larger metropolis. Each establishment was designed as a complex of buildings surrounding courtyards, where different activities took place according to carefully orchestrated schedules. The morning hours were devoted to education and cultural activities, afternoons to business and political discussions, evenings to artistic performances and social gatherings. The architecture itself was designed to facilitate the flow of information and influence that was these institutions' real purpose. Reception halls where initial meetings took place gave way to smaller, more intimate chambers, where serious negotiations could occur without fear of surveillance. Private dining rooms allowed for confidential discussions between individuals who might be political enemies in public, but who needed to coordinate their activities for the good of the empire. Libraries were positioned to be accessible to visitors during daylight hours, allowing scholars, officials, and merchants to research topics relevant to their discussions. These collections often contained works that weren't available in official government libraries: foreign texts, commercial records, personal memoirs, and historical documents that provided perspectives on events that official historians couldn't or wouldn't include in their accounts. The most sophisticated establishments maintained what were essentially private museums, collections of art, artifacts, and cultural objects that served as conversation pieces, but also as repositories of cultural memory. These collections preserved artistic traditions through periods of political upheaval, when official cultural institutions were suppressed or destroyed. The living quarters for the courtesans themselves reflected their status as cultural and intellectual leaders, rather than mere entertainers. Their private apartments were designed as studios where they could pursue their own artistic and scholarly interests, creating works that would contribute to Chinese cultural development for centuries. The gardens that surrounded these buildings were designed not just for aesthetic pleasure, but as outdoor venues for different types of activities. Pavilions positioned throughout the gardens provided settings for poetry readings, musical performances, and philosophical discussions that could continue through the changing seasons. The entire complex was designed to create an environment where the normal social barriers that governed Chinese society could be temporarily suspended, allowing for the kind of frank discussion and cultural exchange that was essential for the functioning of a complex, cosmopolitan civilization. Servants within these establishments were trained not just in domestic duties, but as assistants in the complex work of managing information, arranging meetings, and facilitating the cultural activities that were the institution's real purpose. Many of these assistants were themselves educated individuals who had chosen to work in these environments because they offered opportunities for intellectual growth that weren't available elsewhere in Chinese society. The economic model that supported these institutions was far more sophisticated than simple fee-for-service arrangements. Wealthy patrons would essentially invest in particular establishments, providing funding for their cultural activities, library acquisitions, and artistic projects in exchange for privileged access to the information and influence networks they maintained. What they didn't know was that every conversation was being carefully recorded for purposes that went far beyond entertainment. Li Shishi possessed a mind that could have governed empires, and in many ways it did. Born into poverty in the northern Song capital of Kaifeng, she had transformed herself into the most influential woman in China, through a combination of intellectual brilliance, cultural sophistication, and strategic thinking that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. By the age of 25, she was advising emperors, financing military campaigns, and shaping cultural movements that would influence Chinese civilization for centuries. Her establishment wasn't just a gathering place for the wealthy and powerful. It was an institution of higher learning that provided education unavailable anywhere else in Chinese society. Young men from prominent families would spend years in her tutelage, learning not just the social graces expected of their class, but also practical skills in negotiation, cultural analysis, and strategic thinking that would serve them throughout their careers in government, commerce, or scholarship. The curriculum Lai Shishi developed was more comprehensive than what was offered at the imperial academies. Students learned classical literature, poetry, music, and philosophy, but they also studied contemporary politics, international relations, commercial law, and practical psychology. They learned to read not just Chinese but also Korean, Japanese, and the various Central Asian languages necessary for conducting business along the Silk Road. Most importantly, they learned the subtle arts of influence, how to gather information without appearing to pry, how to share knowledge in ways that created obligation and loyalty, how to navigate the complex networks of personal relationships that actually governed Chinese society beneath the formal structures of imperial administration. Li Shixi own education had been extraordinary even by the standards of her profession. She had memorized the complete works of Confucius, Mencius, and Laozi. She could compose poetry in multiple classical forms, play several musical instruments at a professional level, and paint in the sophisticated landscape style that was reaching its peak during the Song dynasty. But her greatest skill was her ability to synthesize information from multiple sources, to understand political and economic trends before they became obvious to others. She maintained an intelligence network that extended across China and into the neighboring kingdoms. Merchants would report to her about conditions in remote provinces. Diplomatic envoys would share observations about foreign courts. Military officers would confide their assessments of strategic situations. She would integrate this information to develop insights that were far more accurate than what the imperial government was receiving through official channels. Emperor Huizong, one of China's most culturally sophisticated rulers, would regularly disguise himself to attend her salons, not for romantic reasons but because the discussions there provided him with understanding of his empire that he couldn't obtain anywhere else. The policies he implemented were often based on analysis and recommendations that originated in Li Shixi's establishment rather than in his official council meetings. Yang Guifei, the imperial consort whose influence nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty, exemplified a different type of power wielded by these remarkable women. Her relationship with Emperor Xuanzong wasn't just personal, but represented a sophisticated alliance between the imperial court and the commercial networks that were essential for maintaining China's prosperity and international influence. Yang Guifei served as an unofficial ambassador to the various Central Asian kingdoms that controlled the Silk Road trade routes. She spoke Persian, Sogdian, and Turkish, allowing her to negotiate directly with foreign merchants and diplomats without the complications that arose when discussions had to go through official diplomatic channels. Her establishment in Chang'an functioned as an unofficial embassy where foreign dignitaries could conduct business that couldn't be handled through formal diplomatic protocols. Trade agreements, territorial disputes, and military alliances were negotiated in her presence, with her serving as both translator and mediator between parties who might otherwise have been unable to reach mutually beneficial arrangements. The influence these women wielded was so extensive that they essentially functioned as unofficial members of the imperial government, with their advice carrying more weight than that of many official ministers. They attended state functions, participated in policy discussions, and even influenced appointments to high government positions. Their real power came from something far more dangerous than beauty. The education system that flourished within these establishments represented one of the most sophisticated approaches to learning that the world had ever seen, combining classical scholarship with practical training in a way that produced graduates who would go on to shape Chinese civilization in every field from government administration to artistic creation. Yet this educational achievement has been systematically erased from historical memory, leaving modern scholars with an incomplete understanding of how Chinese intellectual culture actually developed. The curriculum was based on the recognition that true education required more than memorizing classical texts. It demanded the ability to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges, to synthesize information from multiple sources, and to understand the complex relationships between culture, politics, and economics that actually governed civilized society. Students began their education with intensive training in classical literature, but this wasn't the rote memorization that characterized formal schools. Instead, they learned to understand these texts as living documents that could provide guidance for addressing contemporary problems. They studied the historical contexts in which these works were created, analyzed how their principles had been applied in different situations, and learned to extract practical wisdom that could inform their own decision-making. Poetry instruction went far beyond technical proficiency in traditional forms. Students learned to use poetic composition as a tool for developing precise observation skills, emotional intelligence, and the ability to communicate complex ideas in ways that could influence others. They studied how different poetic techniques could be used to persuade, inspire, or console, understanding poetry as a form of practical psychology rather than mere artistic expression. Musical training was similarly comprehensive, encompassing not just performance skills, but understanding of how music could be used to create specific emotional states, facilitate group bonding, and even influence political outcomes. Students learned the connections between musical harmony and social harmony, studying how different musical forms had been used throughout Chinese history to support or challenge existing power structures. Philosophy instruction was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the curriculum. Rather than simply memorizing the teachings of various schools of thought, students learned to understand philosophical systems as tools for analyzing complex situations and developing effective responses to challenges. They studied how Confucian principles could be applied to government administration, how Taoist concepts could inform strategic thinking, and how Buddhist psychology could enhance personal effectiveness. But the real innovation of this educational system was its integration of practical training with classical scholarship. Students learned commercial law by actually participating in trade negotiations. They studied military strategy by analyzing ongoing campaigns. They developed diplomatic skills by observing and eventually participating in actual negotiations between different parties. The libraries maintained by these institutions were often more comprehensive than those of official academies, containing not just classical texts, but also contemporary works, foreign literature, commercial records, and historical documents that provided perspectives unavailable in official sources. Students learned to research topics thoroughly, cross-referencing multiple sources, and developing the critical thinking skills necessary for making sound judgments based on incomplete or contradictory information. Language instruction was particularly advanced, with many establishments offering training in Korean, Japanese, Mongolian, Persian, and Arabic. This multilingual capability was essential for anyone who wanted to participate effectively in the international networks that were increasingly important for Chinese prosperity and security. The teaching methods employed were far more interactive than those used in formal schools. Rather than passive listening to lectures, students engaged in debates, participated in role-playing exercises, and worked on real-world projects that required them to apply their learning to actual challenges. They learned by doing rather than by memorizing, developing practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. The social environment of these institutions also contributed to their educational effectiveness. Students from different social backgrounds, geographic regions, and career paths would interact regularly, learning from each other's perspectives and developing the interpersonal skills necessary for success in Chinese society's complex network of personal relationships. Assessment was based not on written examinations, but on demonstrated ability to handle real-world challenges. Students who completed their education in these institutions were recognized by employers, government officials, and other educators as being exceptionally well prepared for leadership roles in whatever fields they chose to pursue. The graduates of this informal educational system would go on to become some of China's most successful merchants, most effective government administrators, most influential artists, and most innovative thinkers. Their success was a testament to the quality of education they had received, yet their alma maters would be systematically excluded from official histories of Chinese educational development. No one could explain why the most brilliant minds of each generation emerged from these forbidden classrooms. The silk curtains rustled softly in the evening breeze as Minister Zhang approached the discreet entrance to what appeared to be an elegant residence in Chang'an's Pingkan ward, but which actually served as the nerve center of an intelligence network that rivaled anything operated by the imperial government. Inside, Madame Li maintained files on every significant political figure in the empire, tracked commercial trends that could affect imperial revenues, and monitored international developments that could threaten Chinese interests along the Silk Road. The information gathered in these establishments wasn't obtained through coercion or espionage in the conventional sense, but through the far more subtle art of creating environments where people wanted to share what they knew. The courtesans who presided over these institutions had mastered the psychology of information exchange, understanding how to make powerful men feel comfortable enough to reveal secrets they would never share in official settings. The physical layout of these establishments was designed to facilitate information gathering through careful attention to acoustics, lighting, and social dynamics. Conversation areas were positioned so that discussions could be overheard by trained listeners who could remember and later transcribe important details. Dining arrangements encouraged the kind of relaxed interaction that led to unguarded revelations. Even the scheduling of activities was calculated to create opportunities for observing who met with whom and when. But the real sophistication lay in the analytical capabilities that allowed these institutions to transform raw information into actionable intelligence. The women who managed these operations weren't just collectors of gossip, they were strategic analysts who could identify patterns, predict outcomes, and develop recommendations that proved remarkably accurate in their assessments of political and economic trends. Li Shixie's establishment, for example, maintained detailed records of grain prices across different regions of the empire, allowing her to predict famines and social unrest weeks or months before official government reports recognized these problems. This information was valuable not just for commercial purposes but for political stability, as regional rebellions often began with economic distress that could be addressed through appropriate government intervention. The intelligence networks operated by these institutions extended far beyond China's borders, incorporating information from Korean courts, Japanese trading missions, Central Asian kingdoms, and even Indian and Persian sources. This international perspective allowed them to anticipate foreign policy challenges and opportunities that the imperial government, with its focus on domestic affairs, often failed to recognize until it was too late to respond effectively. The value of this information was recognized by government officials, who would pay substantial sums for intelligence reports that could inform their decision-making. Military commanders would consult with these establishments before planning campaigns, seeking information about enemy capabilities, local conditions, and political situations that could affect the success of their operations. Commercial intelligence was equally sophisticated, with these institutions tracking trade routes, monitoring currency fluctuations, and assessing market conditions across Asia. Merchants would rely on their analyses when planning trading expeditions, choosing which goods to transport, and deciding where to invest their resources for maximum profit. The diplomatic intelligence gathered by these institutions was perhaps most valuable of all. Foreign diplomats, isolated from their home governments and operating in an unfamiliar cultural environment, often found these establishments to be the only places where they could obtain reliable information about Chinese government intentions, popular sentiment, and factional conflicts that could affect diplomatic negotiations. The courtesans themselves served as unofficial diplomatic channels, able to communicate messages between parties who couldn't meet directly due to political constraints. They could test diplomatic proposals before they were formally presented, gauge reactions to potential policy changes, and even mediate disputes between conflicting parties. The information gathered wasn't just passively collected, but actively analyzed using sophisticated techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by intelligence agencies for centuries. Analysts would cross-reference multiple sources, look for patterns in seemingly unrelated events, and develop predictive models that could anticipate future developments based on current trends. The archives maintained by these institutions preserved information that would have been lost if it had depended solely on official government records. Personal correspondence, commercial contracts, diplomatic communications, and social observations were carefully filed and indexed, creating historical resources that provided perspectives on Chinese civilization that official histories couldn't capture. Quality control was maintained through competitive pressure between different establishments, each seeking to provide the most accurate and valuable intelligence to maintain their reputations and client relationships. Inaccurate information would quickly damage an institution's credibility, creating strong incentives for careful verification and honest analysis. What they discovered in those silk-draped rooms would determine the fate of millions. The ledger books hidden behind false walls in Madame Wang's establishment contained financial records that would have astonished even the imperial treasury officials who thought they understood the Chinese economy. These silk-bound volumes documented commercial transactions that spanned continents, investment partnerships that connected Chinese merchants to trading networks extending from Korea to Constantinople, and financial innovations that wouldn't be seen in European banking for another 500 years. These institutions functioned as sophisticated financial centers that provided services unavailable through conventional commercial channels. They operated as banks, accepting deposits from wealthy clients and providing loans for commercial ventures, real estate purchases, and even government operations when imperial finances were strained. Their lending practices were based on detailed knowledge of borrowers' character, capabilities, and commercial prospects that made their default rates remarkably low. The investment services they provided were particularly innovative, allowing clients to participate in trading expeditions, agricultural ventures, and manufacturing operations without directly managing these enterprises themselves. They developed risk-sharing arrangements that distributed potential losses among multiple investors, while providing management expertise that increased the likelihood of profitable outcomes. Currency exchange was another crucial service, particularly important for the international trade that was essential to Chinese prosperity. These institutions maintained current information about exchange rates across Asia, understanding how political events, natural disasters, and commercial trends could affect the relative values of different currencies. They could provide foreign currency for merchants preparing trading expeditions, or convert foreign coins brought back from successful ventures. The Silk Road trade that connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and ultimately Europe, depended heavily on the financial services provided by these institutions. Merchants needed capital to purchase goods for long-distance transport, insurance against the numerous risks of overland trade, and reliable agents in foreign cities who could handle sales and arrange return shipments. These establishments developed sophisticated insurance products that covered not just the standard risks of theft, weather damage, or political instability, but also more subtle concerns like changes in consumer preferences, currency fluctuations, or disruptions to established trade routes. Their understanding of international conditions allowed them to price these risks accurately and provide protection that made long-distance trade economically viable. Real estate investment was another area where these institutions played crucial roles in Chinese economic development. They would finance the construction of commercial buildings, residential developments, and even infrastructure projects like roads and bridges. Their intimate knowledge of urban development patterns allowed them to identify profitable investment opportunities before they became obvious to other investors. Manufacturing ventures also benefited from their financial support and business expertise. They would provide capital for textile production, ceramic manufacturing, metalworking, and other industries that were essential to Chinese economic growth. Their involvement often included management advice that helped these enterprises operate more efficiently and market their products more effectively. Agricultural investment was particularly important, as the Chinese economy remained fundamentally based on farming despite its growing commercial and manufacturing sectors. These institutions would finance irrigation projects, provide capital for purchasing improved seeds and tools, and even organize cooperative arrangements that allowed small farmers to participate in larger-scale agricultural ventures. The accounting systems developed by these institutions were remarkably sophisticated, using double-entry bookkeeping techniques that provided accurate tracking of complex financial transactions. They maintained detailed records of all their operations, allowing them to analyze performance, identify trends, and make informed decisions about future investments. Commercial law was another area where these institutions made important contributions to Chinese economic development. They developed standardized contracts, arbitration procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms that made commercial transactions more reliable and predictable. Their legal innovations were often adopted by government authorities and incorporated into official commercial codes. International banking services were particularly sophisticated, allowing Chinese merchants to conduct business across vast distances without the risks associated with transporting large amounts of precious metals. They developed credit instruments that could be honored by correspondent institutions in foreign cities, making long-distance trade safer and more efficient. The economic intelligence they gathered was crucial for making sound investment decisions. They monitored crop conditions across different regions, tracked political developments that could affect trade routes, and analyzed consumer trends that could influence demand for different products. This information allowed them to anticipate market changes and position their investments accordingly. Their economic influence extended beyond their direct business activities to shape broader patterns of Chinese economic development. The industries they chose to finance, the trade routes they supported, and the innovations they promoted had lasting effects on the structure and capabilities of the Chinese economy. But their most valuable currency wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more precious. The morning light filtered through paper windows as Li Qingzhao, arguably China's greatest female poet, put the finishing touches on verses that would outlast dynasties, her brush moving with practiced elegance across silk that had been prepared according to techniques perfected in establishments that history would later try to erase. What made her genius possible wasn't just individual talent, but an entire cultural ecosystem that had developed within these institutions, creating the conditions for artistic innovation that would shape Chinese aesthetic sensibilities for over 1,000 years. The courtesan poets who presided over these establishments weren't just performers of existing works, but creators of new artistic forms that pushed the boundaries of Chinese literary and musical expression. They developed innovative poetic techniques, experimented with new musical arrangements, and created integrated artistic performances that combined poetry, music, dance, and visual arts in ways that hadn't been attempted before. The education they received was far more comprehensive than what was available to male scholars in official academies. They studied not just classical literature but also contemporary works, foreign literary traditions, and experimental forms that were being developed by other artists in their networks. This broad foundation allowed them to synthesize influences from multiple sources to create genuinely original artistic expressions. Poetry was considered the highest form of literary art, and the standards maintained in these establishments were extraordinarily demanding. Students learned not just traditional forms like regulated verse and psi lyrics, but also how to adapt these forms to express contemporary experiences and emotions. They studied the technical aspects of prosody, parallelism, and tonal patterns, but also developed the sensitivity to language and emotion that distinguished great poetry from mere technical competence. The poetry created in these establishments often addressed themes that were considered too controversial or emotionally complex for official literature. Love poetry, of course, but also political commentary disguised as personal reflection, social criticism expressed through natural imagery, and philosophical speculation that challenged conventional thinking about human nature and social organization. Musical innovation was equally impressive, with courtesans developing new instrumental techniques, creating original compositions, and experimenting with combinations of different musical traditions. They were familiar with not just Chinese musical forms but also Korean, Japanese, Central Asian, and even Indian musical styles, allowing them to create fusion compositions that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Tang and Song civilization. The integration of poetry and music reached extraordinary levels of sophistication, with compositions that used the tonal qualities of Chinese language to create musical effects that enhanced the emotional impact of the verses. These integrated performances required years of training to master, as performers had to excel in both literary and musical skills, while also developing the dramatic abilities necessary for effective presentation. Visual arts were equally important, with many courtesans becoming accomplished painters, calligraphers, and designers. Their artistic training was comprehensive, covering not just technical skills, but also aesthetic theory, art history, and the cultural meanings of different artistic traditions. They created works that were valued by collectors and displayed in imperial palaces, contributing to the development of Chinese artistic traditions in ways that went far beyond mere decoration. The interior design of these establishments reflected their residents' artistic sophistication, with carefully curated collections of paintings, calligraphy, ceramics, and other art objects that created environments of extraordinary beauty and cultural richness. These spaces served as informal museums that preserved artistic traditions through periods of political upheaval, when official cultural institutions were threatened or destroyed. Literary salons hosted in these establishments became centers for discussing new artistic developments, sharing works in progress, and collaborating on creative projects that involved multiple artists working together. These collaborative efforts produced some of the most innovative works of Chinese literature and music, creating artistic forms that wouldn't have been possible without the creative communities that these institutions fostered. The patronage system that supported these artistic activities was remarkably sophisticated, with wealthy clients providing financial support for creative projects in exchange for the cultural prestige associated with supporting the arts. This patronage allowed artists to pursue experimental projects that might not have been commercially viable, but which advanced the development of Chinese artistic traditions. Publishing and distribution networks developed by these institutions ensured that artistic works created in their environments could reach wider audiences. They maintained their own printing facilities, organized distribution networks, and even developed literary criticism that helped promote appreciation for new artistic forms. The influence of courtesans on Chinese literary development was so extensive that many of the forms and themes that define classical Chinese literature actually originated in their creative communities. The romantic poetry, nature imagery, and emotional sophistication that characterize the greatest works of Chinese literature all reflect aesthetic sensibilities that were cultivated and refined in these establishments. Foreign visitors to China were often more impressed by the artistic achievements they encountered in these institutions than by the official cultural displays they were shown at court. The creativity, sophistication, and emotional depth of the artistic works they witnessed challenged their assumptions about Chinese civilization and contributed to international appreciation for Chinese cultural achievements. Yet, beneath all this beauty lay a darker truth about power and survival. The caravan dust had barely settled outside the walls of Samarkand when the message arrived at Liu Rushi's establishment in Yangzhou, carried by a network of communication that moved information across Asia faster than any official diplomatic service could manage. The year was sick, and despite the political chaos engulfing China as the Ming dynasty collapsed, the intelligence networks that connected these institutions continued to function with remarkable efficiency, maintaining the flow of information that kept international trade and diplomacy operating even when governments failed. These establishments served as crucial waypoints along the Silk Road, providing services that went far beyond simple accommodation for weary travelers. They functioned as informal embassies where foreign merchants could obtain information about local conditions, navigate complex bureaucratic requirements, and establish the personal relationships that were essential for successful commercial ventures in Chinese markets. The linguistic capabilities of courtesans who worked in these Silk Road stations were extraordinary, with many speaking 4 or 5 languages fluently and maintaining conversational ability in several others. They served as translators not just for individual conversations, but for complex negotiations involving parties who shared no common language. Their cultural knowledge allowed them to explain not just what was being said, but why it was being said in particular ways, helping foreign visitors understand the subtle meanings that could determine the success or failure of their missions. Commercial intelligence flowed through these networks with remarkable speed and accuracy. A political development in Constantinople would be known in Beijing within months, allowing Chinese merchants to adjust their trading strategies before their competitors learned of changing conditions. Currency fluctuations, crop failures, military campaigns, and political changes across the known world were all tracked and analyzed by intelligence networks that used these establishments as collection and distribution points. Diplomatic communications often traveled through these unofficial channels when official diplomatic relations were strained or when governments needed to communicate messages that couldn't be sent through formal diplomatic protocols. The courtesans who managed these communications understood the nuances of international relations well enough to encode and decode messages that contained sensitive political information. Cultural exchange was perhaps even more important than commercial or diplomatic activities. These establishments served as centers where artistic traditions, philosophical ideas, technological innovations, and social practices from different civilizations could be shared and adapted. Chinese poetry would influence Persian literature, Indian mathematical concepts would be transmitted to Chinese scholars, Central Asian musical forms would be incorporated into Chinese compositions. The preservation of foreign cultural materials was another crucial service provided by these institutions. They maintained libraries that contained works in multiple languages, preserving texts that might have been lost during political upheavals in their countries of origin. Chinese scholars studying foreign civilizations often relied on materials preserved in these collections rather than official government archives. Religious and philosophical exchange was facilitated by the cosmopolitan atmosphere of these establishments where Buddhist monks, Taoist masters, Islamic scholars, and Christian missionaries could engage in discussions that would have been impossible in more formal religious settings. These conversations contributed to the development of syncretic religious and philosophical traditions that enriched Chinese intellectual life. Technological innovation spread through these networks as merchants and craftsmen shared knowledge about new techniques, improved tools, and innovative materials. Silk production techniques, metalworking methods, ceramic glazing processes, and countless other technological developments were transmitted across Asia through the informal knowledge-sharing networks that these establishments facilitated. The economic integration of Asia was largely accomplished through the commercial networks that used these institutions as coordinating centers. They developed standardized practices for international trade, established credit relationships that extended across continents, and created dispute resolution mechanisms that allowed merchants from different cultures to conduct business with confidence. Intelligence about military developments was particularly valuable, as war could disrupt trade routes and threaten the safety of merchant expeditions. These establishments tracked the movements of armies, monitored political alliances that could lead to conflict, and provided early warning of military campaigns that could affect commercial activities. The social networks that connected these institutions created a kind of international community that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. Courtesans who had worked in different cities along the Silk Road would maintain correspondence throughout their lives, sharing information and providing assistance to travelers who carried recommendations from colleagues in distant cities. Marriage and family connections often linked these institutions across vast distances, creating kinship networks that provided additional channels for communication and mutual support. The children of courtesans who had worked in different cities would sometimes grow up with international perspectives that prepared them for careers in diplomacy or international commerce. The secrets they kept could start wars or create peace across vast empires. Emperor Hongwu's calloused hands gripped the imperial edict that would reshape Chinese society, his peasant background making him suspicious of the sophisticated urban culture that had flourished under the previous Yuan dynasty. The year was 1368, and the founder of the Ming dynasty was determined to create a moral order based on rigid Confucian principles that left no room for the complex cultural institutions that had served as centers of learning, artistic creation, and political influence for over 1,000 years. The imperial proclamation that emerged from the Forbidden City was comprehensive in its condemnation and systematic in its approach to cultural destruction. These establishments were declared illegal, not just as commercial enterprises, but as threats to social order that corrupted public morals and undermined the authority of legitimate government institutions. The edict ordered their immediate closure and threatened severe punishments for anyone who continued to operate or patronize them. But the crackdown went far beyond simple prohibition. It represented a systematic attempt to rewrite Chinese cultural history. Official historians were directed to minimize or eliminate references to the cultural contributions these institutions had made to Chinese civilization. Libraries were purged of works that had been created in these environments. Art collections were confiscated and either destroyed or redistributed to more acceptable institutions. The educational functions that these establishments had served were transferred to government-controlled academies that emphasized classical learning and moral indoctrination, rather than the practical skills and creative thinking that had characterized the informal education system. Students who had been educated in the suppressed institutions found their qualifications questioned and their career prospects limited by their association with the discredited system. Economic activities that had been coordinated through these institutions were forced to reorganize around merchant guilds and government-regulated commercial associations. The sophisticated financial services they had provided were replaced by more limited banking operations that operated under strict government supervision. International trade networks had to develop new coordination mechanisms that were less efficient but more acceptable to government authorities. Artistic communities that had flourished in these environments were scattered, with individual artists forced to seek patronage from government officials or wealthy families who were willing to risk official disapproval. Many artistic forms that had been developed in these institutions were abandoned because they were associated with the suppressed culture. The collaborative artistic projects that had produced some of China's greatest cultural achievements became impossible to organize. The intelligence networks that had operated through these institutions were forced underground, continuing to function, but with greatly reduced effectiveness. The flow of information that had been essential for effective government administration was disrupted, leading to policy decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. The early warning systems that had helped prevent famines and social unrest were dismantled, contributing to the administrative problems that would plague the Ming dynasty throughout its existence. Women who had achieved positions of influence and respect in the suppressed system found themselves relegated to conventional domestic roles, with no outlets for their intellectual and artistic capabilities. The educational opportunities that had allowed exceptional women to develop their talents were eliminated, representing a significant loss of human resources for Chinese society. International relations were affected as foreign diplomats and merchants lost access to the informal channels that had facilitated communication and negotiation. The cultural exchange that had enriched Chinese civilization by exposing it to foreign ideas and practices was reduced to official diplomatic contacts that were much more limited in scope and effectiveness. The enforcement of the prohibition was initially vigorous, with government officials conducting raids, making arrests, and imposing punishments that were intended to deter any attempts to revive the suppressed institutions. However, the deep cultural roots of these institutions and the valuable services they provided ensured that modified versions would continue to operate despite official disapproval. Underground networks developed to preserve some of the cultural traditions and educational practices that had been suppressed. Secret societies emerged to maintain artistic communities and provide informal education that wasn't available through official channels. These underground activities were necessarily limited in scope and effectiveness, but they kept alive cultural traditions that might otherwise have been completely lost. Regional variations in enforcement allowed some establishments to continue operating in modified forms, particularly in areas where local officials were more concerned with practical governance than moral purification. These surviving institutions had to be much more discreet in their operations, but they continued to provide some of the services that had made them valuable to Chinese society. The economic costs of the suppression gradually became apparent as the efficiency of commercial operations declined, and the quality of available information for decision-making deteriorated. Some government officials began to recognize that the suppressed institutions had served important functions that weren't being adequately replaced by official alternatives. But what the emperors tried to destroy had already spread too deep into Chinese society to ever be completely eliminated. The Kangxi Emperor's private study contained 2 sets of documents that told contradictory stories about his government's policy toward the cultural institutions his predecessors had tried to eliminate. The official proclamations continued the Ming dynasty's moral condemnation, declaring these establishments to be threats to public virtue that had no place in a properly ordered Confucian society. But the confidential memoranda revealed a different reality. His administration depended on the intelligence, cultural services, and diplomatic channels these institutions provided, even as it publicly denounced their existence. The Qing dynasty's approach to these institutions reflected the complex challenges facing a Manchu government that ruled over a predominantly Han Chinese population. The official prohibition served important political purposes, demonstrating the new dynasty's commitment to Confucian moral principles, while appealing to conservative elements in Chinese society who supported traditional values. But practical governance required access to the sophisticated information networks and cultural expertise that these institutions had developed over centuries. Intelligence gathering was particularly crucial for the Qing government, which needed detailed information about potential resistance movements, regional economic conditions, and foreign threats that could destabilize their rule. The establishments that continued to operate despite official prohibition provided access to information that wasn't available through conventional government channels. Their networks extended into all levels of Chinese society and connected to international sources that could provide early warning of external threats. Diplomatic communications with foreign governments often required the kind of informal channels that these institutions had traditionally provided. Official diplomatic protocols were too rigid and visible for sensitive negotiations, particularly when dealing with European powers who were beginning to challenge Chinese sovereignty. The cultural sophistication and linguistic capabilities of courtesans made them valuable intermediaries for diplomatic communications that couldn't be conducted through formal channels. Economic intelligence remained essential for effective governance, and the Qing administration continued to rely on information networks that had their roots in the suppressed institutions. Tax collection, trade regulation, and monetary policy all required detailed knowledge of economic conditions that could only be obtained through the extensive commercial networks these establishments maintained. Cultural legitimacy was another area where the Qing dynasty faced particular challenges, as foreign rulers trying to govern a sophisticated Chinese population. The artistic and literary traditions associated with these institutions represented aspects of Chinese culture that were deeply valued by educated elites. Complete suppression of these traditions would have alienated important segments of the population, whose support was necessary for stable governance. Regional administration was complicated by the fact that local officials often maintained relationships with these institutions regardless of official policy. The practical benefits they provided for local governance, information, mediation services, cultural activities that maintained social stability were too valuable to abandon completely. Central government authorities had to balance their official disapproval with recognition that complete enforcement would undermine administrative effectiveness. The examination system that provided government officials continued to depend partly on educational services that had their origins in the suppressed institutions. Many of the scholars who achieved success in official examinations had received supplementary education that wasn't available through conventional schools. The cultural knowledge and practical skills they had acquired in these environments made them more effective administrators, even though their educational background couldn't be officially acknowledged. Military intelligence was another area where these institutions continued to provide valuable services despite official prohibition. Their networks could provide information about regional conditions, popular sentiment, and potential security threats that military commanders needed for effective operations. The informal nature of these intelligence sources made them particularly valuable for identifying problems before they became serious enough to require military intervention. Commercial regulation required understanding of business practices and market conditions that could only be obtained through participation in the commercial networks these institutions facilitated. Government efforts to control trade, collect customs duties, and prevent smuggling all depended on information and cooperation that required maintaining relationships with suppressed institutions. Cultural production continued to depend partly on artistic communities that had their roots in the suppressed system. The poetry, painting, music, and other artistic works that were valued by the imperial court often came from artists who had been trained in traditional methods that weren't available through official cultural institutions. The quality of cultural production declined when these traditional training methods were completely suppressed. International trade relationships required the kind of cultural intermediation that these institutions had traditionally provided. Foreign merchants needed to understand Chinese business practices, legal requirements, and cultural expectations in order to operate successfully. The linguistic and cultural services provided by courtesans were essential for maintaining the international commercial relationships that contributed to Chinese prosperity. Legal and administrative services provided by these institutions continued to be valuable for resolving disputes and facilitating business relationships. Their understanding of both formal legal requirements and informal social expectations made them effective mediators for conflicts that couldn't be resolved through official judicial procedures. The very emperors who banned them couldn't govern without them. Reverend Morrison stepped off the merchant vessel at Canton in 1807, his Protestant certainties intact and his mission clear to bring Christian salvation to what he assumed was a morally degraded civilization that desperately needed Western guidance. What he encountered in the sophisticated cultural institutions of Qing dynasty China challenged none of his preconceptions, because he lacked the cultural knowledge necessary to understand what he was actually observing. His reports back to missionary societies in London would establish interpretive frameworks that would distort Western understanding of Chinese civilization for over 2 centuries. The religious and cultural background that shaped Western observers' perceptions made it virtually impossible for them to recognize the educational, artistic, and political functions these institutions served. Protestant missionary training emphasized moral categories that reduced complex social phenomena to simple questions of virtue and vice. The sophisticated cultural ecosystem that had produced some of China's greatest intellectual and artistic achievements was dismissed as evidence of moral corruption that confirmed Western assumptions about Asian inferiority. Language barriers compounded the misunderstanding, as few Western observers possessed the linguistic skills necessary to understand the poetry, philosophy, and cultural criticism that represented the highest achievements of these institutions. The literary works they produced, which would have been recognized as sophisticated cultural achievements if created in European contexts, were dismissed as morally objectionable, without any serious attempt to understand their artistic or intellectual content. The social dynamics that governed these institutions were completely misunderstood by observers who approached them with European assumptions about class relationships and gender roles. The educational functions they served, the political influence they wielded, and the cultural leadership they provided were invisible to visitors who expected to find only simple commercial transactions governed by European moral categories. Historical methodology employed by Western scholars reflected the same cultural biases that distorted contemporary observations. Chinese sources that described the cultural and political importance of these institutions were dismissed as unreliable, because they contradicted Western assumptions about proper social organization. Archaeological evidence that demonstrated their sophistication was ignored or misinterpreted, because it didn't fit established theoretical frameworks. Academic disciplines that might have provided more sophisticated understanding, anthropology, sociology, cultural studies, were either non-existent or too primitive to offer alternative interpretive approaches. Western scholarship was dominated by religious and philosophical traditions that emphasized moral judgment rather than cultural analysis, making objective study of these institutions virtually impossible. Comparative studies that might have revealed the similarities between these Chinese institutions and analogous cultural centers in other civilizations were never attempted because Western scholars weren't aware that such comparisons might be valuable. The salons of Enlightenment Europe, the academies of Renaissance Italy, and the cultural centers of classical Athens served similar functions in their respective societies, but these connections weren't recognized because of cultural prejudices that prevented serious comparative analysis. The political functions these institutions served were particularly misunderstood, because Western observers had no experience with the complex informal power networks that characterized Chinese governance. The idea that important political decisions might be made outside official government channels contradicted Western assumptions about proper administrative procedures, making it impossible for foreign observers to recognize the actual political processes they were witnessing. Economic activities were similarly misunderstood because Western commercial experience didn't include the sophisticated financial services and international trading networks these institutions facilitated. The complex credit relationships, insurance arrangements, and investment partnerships they developed were dismissed as evidence of moral corruption rather than recognized as innovative financial instruments that facilitated economic development. Artistic achievements were devalued because Western aesthetic standards didn't provide criteria for evaluating Chinese literary and musical forms. The collaborative artistic projects, experimental techniques, and cultural innovations these institutions promoted were dismissed as inferior imitations of European models rather than recognized as original contributions to world cultural development. Educational functions were completely overlooked because Western observers couldn't conceive of legitimate education occurring outside formally established schools and universities. The sophisticated curriculum, innovative teaching methods, and high academic standards maintained by these institutions were invisible to visitors who expected education to conform to European institutional models. The women who presided over these institutions were particularly misunderstood because Western gender assumptions made it impossible to recognize their intellectual achievements, political influence, and cultural leadership. Their literary works were dismissed, their political activities were ignored, and their educational contributions were denied because Western observers couldn't accept that women might possess such capabilities. International diplomacy was another area where Western misunderstanding had serious consequences. Foreign diplomatic missions failed to recognize the importance of these institutions in Chinese political processes, missing opportunities for cultural exchange and diplomatic cooperation that might have prevented some of the conflicts that characterized China's relationships with Western powers. The accumulation of these misunderstandings created scholarly and popular literature that fundamentally distorted Western understanding of Chinese civilization. Academic works, missionary reports, travel accounts, and government documents all reflected the same cultural biases that made objective analysis impossible. What Western eyes saw was only the surface of something far more profound. The hidden chamber behind the false wall in Li Qingzhao's former residence yielded treasures that would revolutionize understanding of Chinese literary history when it was finally opened by scholars in the silk-wrapped manuscripts contained not just her personal poetry but an entire library of works created by women whose literary genius had been systematically erased from official cultural records. These were the voices that had shaped Chinese aesthetic sensibilities for over a millennium, preserved in secret because their institutional origins had made them unacceptable to orthodox literary historians. The poetry recovered from these hidden archives revealed artistic achievements that challenged every assumption about the development of Chinese literature. The technical sophistication, emotional depth, and philosophical complexity of these works equaled or exceeded anything in the official literary canon. Yet they had been excluded from scholarly consideration because of their association with suppressed cultural institutions. The discovery forced a complete reconsideration of how Chinese literary traditions had actually developed. Innovative poetic forms that had been attributed to male scholars were revealed to have originated in the creative communities associated with these institutions. The seed lyrics that became one of China's most distinctive poetic forms showed clear evidence of development through collaborative processes that involved multiple poets working together to refine techniques and explore new possibilities for emotional expression. Philosophical poetry that addressed questions about human nature, social organization, and the meaning of existence demonstrated intellectual sophistication that rivaled the work of officially recognized philosophers. These poems approached fundamental questions through personal experience and emotional insight, rather than abstract theoretical analysis, providing perspectives on human existence that weren't available in formal philosophical works. Love poetry that had been dismissed as morally objectionable was revealed to be psychologically sophisticated exploration of human relationships that provided insights into emotional dynamics that formal literature couldn't address. The understanding of human psychology demonstrated in these works exceeded anything available in contemporary Western literature, and provided a foundation for later developments in Chinese literary expression. Political commentary disguised as personal reflection revealed sophisticated understanding of governance, social justice, and the relationship between individual experience and political organization. These works provided critiques of existing social arrangements and proposals for alternative approaches to social organization that were far more advanced than anything available in official political literature. Nature poetry that used landscape imagery to explore philosophical and emotional themes demonstrated an understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and natural environment that wouldn't be matched in Western literature until the Romantic movement. The integration of subjective experience with objective natural observation created artistic effects that influenced Chinese aesthetic sensibilities for centuries. Historical poetry that addressed the rise and fall of dynasties, the experiences of war and social upheaval, and the personal costs of political change provided perspectives on Chinese history that weren't available in official historical records. These works preserved popular memory of historical events and offered interpretations that challenged official historical narratives. Musical compositions that integrated poetic texts with sophisticated musical arrangements demonstrated artistic synthesis that created new forms of cultural expression. The collaboration between poets and musicians in these institutions produced artistic works that couldn't have been created by individual artists working in isolation. Literary criticism and aesthetic theory developed in these institutions influenced the development of Chinese literary standards and evaluation methods. The critical approaches they developed provided frameworks for analyzing artistic works that were more sophisticated than anything available in official academic literature. Translation work that made foreign literary traditions accessible to Chinese audiences contributed to the development of Chinese literary techniques by exposing domestic artists to alternative approaches to artistic expression. The linguistic skills available in these institutions made possible cultural exchange that enriched Chinese literary development in ways that wouldn't have been possible through official cultural institutions alone. Publishing and distribution networks developed by these institutions ensured that literary works created in their environments could reach wider audiences despite official disapproval. They developed innovative methods for circulating literature that avoided government censorship while building audiences for artistic works that might not have received official support. Preservation efforts undertaken by these institutions saved literary works that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political upheaval, when official cultural institutions were threatened or destroyed. Their archives contained works by authors whose other writings had been lost, providing the only surviving examples of important literary achievements. Educational programs that trained new generations of poets, critics, and literary scholars ensured the continuation of literary traditions that might otherwise have disappeared when their institutional support was eliminated. The informal educational networks they maintained preserved literary knowledge and techniques that weren't available through official educational institutions. Collaborative relationships between institutions in different cities created literary networks that facilitated artistic exchange and mutual influence among creative communities across China. These networks provided support systems for individual artists and created opportunities for artistic collaboration that enhanced the quality and diversity of literary production. The stories they preserved contained secrets that could unlock the true nature of Chinese civilization. The secret meeting in Madame Chen's establishment in Shanghai should have been impossible in 1911, with Qing dynasty authorities desperately trying to suppress the revolutionary activities that threatened to topple 2 centuries of Manchu rule. Yet here, in silk-draped rooms that imperial investigators would never think to search, Sun Yat-sen's Republican conspirators planned the uprising that would reshape Chinese civilization. The networks that had preserved cultural traditions through centuries of political oppression had evolved into channels for revolutionary communication that proved impossible for government authorities to detect or disrupt. The institutional knowledge these establishments possessed about operating under hostile government surveillance made them natural centers for revolutionary organization. They had spent centuries developing methods for maintaining communication networks, preserving sensitive information, and coordinating activities across vast geographic distances despite official disapproval. These skills proved invaluable for revolutionary movements that faced similar challenges of organization and communication under authoritarian governments. The social networks that connected these institutions provided ready-made communication channels for revolutionary messages and coordination. The personal relationships that linked establishments in different cities created secure methods for transmitting information and moving people that government authorities couldn't monitor effectively. Revolutionary leaders could travel across China using these networks without leaving traces that official investigators could follow. Financial resources available through these institutions supported revolutionary activities that required funding for weapons, propaganda, and organizational expenses. The sophisticated financial networks they had developed provided methods for transferring money and other resources that avoided government banking systems where transactions could be monitored and traced. Safe houses and meeting places were readily available through these networks, providing secure locations where revolutionary leaders could plan activities without fear of government surveillance. The discreet nature of these establishments and their experience with maintaining confidentiality made them ideal venues for sensitive political discussions. Intelligence capabilities that these institutions had developed for commercial and cultural purposes were easily adapted for gathering information about government activities, military movements, and official plans for suppressing revolutionary activities. Their information networks could provide early warning of government crackdowns and help revolutionary leaders avoid arrest. International connections maintained by these institutions provided channels for communicating with foreign supporters and obtaining resources from overseas Chinese communities that supported revolutionary causes. The linguistic capabilities and cultural knowledge available in these institutions facilitated communication with foreign governments and organizations that might provide assistance. Propaganda distribution was another area where these institutions proved valuable for revolutionary movements. Their existing networks for circulating literature and cultural materials could be used to distribute revolutionary publications and political messages to audiences that might not be reached through conventional channels. Recruitment activities benefited from the social connections these institutions maintained with educated elites who might be sympathetic to revolutionary causes. The salon environments they provided were ideal for identifying potential supporters and gradually introducing them to revolutionary ideas through informal discussions that didn't directly challenge their existing political commitments. Training facilities for revolutionary activists could be provided discreetly in establishments that were experienced in conducting educational programs without official approval. The teaching methods and organizational systems these institutions had developed could be adapted for training revolutionary cadres in political theory, organizational techniques, and practical skills needed for political action. Code systems and secret communications that these institutions had developed for commercial and personal purposes could be adapted for revolutionary use. Their experience with maintaining confidential communications made them valuable resources for developing security measures that could protect revolutionary organizations from government surveillance. Document storage and preservation capabilities that these institutions had developed for cultural and commercial purposes proved valuable for maintaining revolutionary archives and preserving important political documents. Their methods for hiding sensitive materials had been refined over centuries of avoiding government censorship and confiscation. Regional coordination was facilitated by the geographic distribution of these institutions and their established methods for maintaining communication and cooperation across distances. Revolutionary movements could use these networks to coordinate activities in different regions, while maintaining the security that came from distributed organization. Legal protection was available through the commercial and cultural activities these institutions conducted openly, providing cover for revolutionary activities that could be conducted discreetly alongside legitimate business. The respectable public facades these institutions maintained made them less likely to attract official suspicion. International escape routes were available through the same networks that had been used for commercial and cultural exchange with foreign countries. Revolutionary leaders who needed to flee China could use these established channels to reach safety in foreign countries where they could continue their political activities. The revolution didn't start in universities or government buildings. It began in silk-draped rooms, where rebels gathered in secret. Madame Liu's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the silk screen that concealed the radio equipment hidden behind a false wall in her Shanghai establishment, knowing that discovery would mean death, not just for herself, but for everyone who depended on the intelligence network she had spent decades building. The year was 1938. And the Japanese occupation of eastern China had transformed these institutions from centers of culture and commerce into crucial nodes in the resistance network that was China's only hope for maintaining some semblance of independence under foreign rule. The transformation required extraordinary courage and sophisticated deception, as these establishments had to appear to collaborate with Japanese authorities while actually serving as centers for gathering intelligence, maintaining communication with Free China forces, and preserving Chinese cultural identity during a period when the occupying government was systematically attempting to erase Chinese civilization. Intelligence gathering became more dangerous, but also more crucial than ever before. Japanese military plans, troop movements, supply situations, and administrative policies all needed to be monitored and reported to Chinese resistance forces. The social environments these establishments Br0thels gave them unique access to Japanese officials, who might reveal sensitive information during moments of relaxation or emotional vulnerability. Communication networks that had been developed for commercial and cultural purposes were adapted to maintain contact with the nationalist government in Chongqing and communist forces operating behind Japanese lines. These networks provided the only reliable methods for coordinating resistance activities across the vast territories under Japanese control. Safe houses and escape routes were established to help Chinese officials, military officers, and cultural leaders escape from Japanese-controlled areas to free China territories where they could continue their service to the Chinese cause. The discreet nature of these establishments and their experience with maintaining confidentiality made them ideal for these dangerous humanitarian activities. Cultural preservation became a form of resistance as these institutions worked to maintain Chinese artistic traditions, educational practices, and intellectual life, despite Japanese efforts to replace Chinese culture with Japanese alternatives. They secretly maintained schools, libraries, and artistic communities that preserved Chinese civilization during the occupation period. Economic resistance was conducted through these institutions' commercial networks, which were used to disrupt Japanese economic exploitation of Chinese resources and redirect materials and information to support Chinese resistance efforts. Black market activities, currency manipulation, and trade disruption all depended on the commercial expertise these institutions had developed over centuries. Propaganda activities were carefully coordinated to maintain Chinese morale while avoiding Japanese censorship. These institutions developed sophisticated methods for circulating information about resistance activities, international developments, and Chinese government policies that helped maintain popular support for continued resistance to Japanese occupation. Recruitment of resistance workers was conducted through the social networks these institutions maintained, identifying individuals who might be willing to risk their lives for Chinese independence. The salon environments they provided allowed for careful evaluation of potential recruits without directly exposing resistance organizations to government infiltration. Sabotage activities were coordinated through these networks, using the commercial and social connections they maintained to identify targets, obtain necessary materials, and coordinate timing of operations. The knowledge these institutions possessed about industrial facilities, transportation networks, and administrative systems made them valuable resources for planning effective sabotage operations. Medical support for resistance activities was provided through these institutions' connections with healthcare professionals and medical facilities. Wounded resistance fighters could receive treatment through these networks without alerting Japanese authorities to their activities. Financial support for resistance operations was provided through the sophisticated banking and investment networks these institutions had developed. Resources could be transferred, hidden, and distributed to support resistance activities while avoiding Japanese financial controls. International connections were maintained through these institutions' foreign contacts, providing channels for communication with allied governments and overseas Chinese communities that could provide resources and political support for Chinese resistance efforts. Document forgery and identity protection services were provided for resistance workers who needed false papers to avoid Japanese security measures. The administrative knowledge these institutions possessed about Chinese bureaucratic systems helped them create convincingly authentic documentation. Women's participation in resistance activities was facilitated through these institutions, which provided the only organizational framework that allowed women to play significant roles in political and military activities. Many of the most effective resistance leaders were women who used their positions in these institutions to coordinate activities that male-dominated resistance organizations couldn't have managed. The moral complexity of their situation required sophisticated ethical reasoning as they balanced the appearance of collaboration with the reality of resistance. They had to maintain relationships with Japanese officials, while secretly working to undermine Japanese rule, making choices that would be misunderstood by future historians who didn't appreciate the impossible circumstances they faced. Their greatest act of patriotism was one history would never acknowledge. The loudspeakers mounted on trucks that rolled through Beijing streets in October 1949 proclaimed the dawn of a new China, where women would achieve complete equality and the exploitation of feudal society would be eliminated forever. But in the rooms where Madame Zhang had spent 4 decades building networks that preserved Chinese culture and facilitated international commerce, The reality of revolutionary transformation proved far more complex than the slogans suggested. The Communist Party's campaign to eliminate these institutions represented not just political reform, but an attempt to fundamentally reshape Chinese civilization by destroying cultural traditions that had survived every previous political upheaval. The initial phase of the campaign involved mass meetings, where former courtesans were required to publicly confess their involvement in what was now characterized as exploitation of the masses. These speaking bitterness sessions were designed to break down psychological resistance to the new order, while demonstrating the moral authority of the Communist Party to judge and transform existing social relationships. Re-education programs were established to provide former courtesans with new skills and political consciousness that would allow them to participate in socialist society. These programs involved intensive ideological instruction combined with vocational training for factory work, agricultural labor, or other occupations that were considered appropriate for the new social order. Property confiscation eliminated the economic foundations that had supported these institutions for centuries. Buildings, art collections, libraries, and other assets were seized by government authorities and redistributed to serve revolutionary purposes. The sophisticated infrastructure that had facilitated cultural, commercial, and political activities was dismantled and replaced with simpler organizational structures that could be more easily controlled by government authorities. Cultural suppression involved systematic elimination of artistic forms, literary traditions, and educational practices that had been developed in these institutions. Poetry, music, and other artistic works were banned as feudal remnants that had no place in socialist society. The collaborative artistic methods that had produced some of China's greatest cultural achievements were replaced by collective approaches that emphasized political content over aesthetic innovation. Historical revision was undertaken to eliminate references to the positive contributions these institutions had made to Chinese civilization. Official histories were rewritten to characterize them as purely exploitative relationships that had oppressed women and corrupted society. The educational, artistic, and political achievements of these institutions were systematically denied or attributed to other sources. International isolation eliminated the foreign connections that had made these institutions valuable for diplomacy and commerce. The cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized these institutions was replaced by a focus on domestic development and ideological purity that made international cultural exchange suspect and potentially treasonous. Economic reorganization replaced the sophisticated financial services these institutions had provided, with centralized planning systems that eliminated private commercial initiative. The investment, banking, and insurance services that had facilitated economic development were transferred to government agencies that operated according to political rather than commercial criteria. Social transformation involved changing the role of women from positions of cultural and economic leadership to participation in mass organizations that emphasized political activism over individual achievement. The intellectual and artistic capabilities that had been developed in these institutions were redirected toward collective goals that served revolutionary purposes. Educational replacement involved establishing formal schools and universities that could provide the services these institutions had offered, while maintaining ideological control over curriculum and teaching methods. The informal educational networks that had preserved knowledge through previous political upheavals were replaced by institutional structures that could be monitored and controlled by government authorities. Legal persecution was used to eliminate individuals who attempted to maintain traditional practices or who resisted participation in re-education programs. Former courtesans who couldn't adapt to the new social order faced imprisonment, exile, or worse punishments that demonstrated the seriousness of the government's commitment to eliminating these institutions. Cultural memory was attacked through campaigns that encouraged children to criticize their parents and students to denounce their teachers for involvement in feudal practices. The generational transmission of cultural knowledge that had preserved these traditions through previous political changes was deliberately disrupted to prevent their revival. Underground persistence continued despite official suppression, with some individuals maintaining traditional practices in secret, while publicly conforming to revolutionary requirements. These underground activities were necessarily limited in scope and effectiveness, but they preserved some cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost. Regional variation in enforcement allowed some traditional practices to continue in areas where local officials were more focused on economic development than ideological purity. These surviving remnants were necessarily much more discreet than their predecessors, but they maintained some continuity with traditional Chinese culture. The psychological costs of transformation were enormous for individuals who had spent their lives developing cultural and intellectual capabilities that were now characterized as worthless or harmful. The personal trauma of being forced to repudiate their life's work contributed to a broader cultural trauma that affected Chinese society for generations. But you can't destroy something that was never just about what people thought it was about. The Cultural Revolution's Red Guards had swept through Beijing's ancient neighborhoods like a destroying flood, smashing traditional artifacts, burning classical books, and forcing elderly residents to publicly denounce their feudal past. Yet in a basement room beneath what appeared to be an ordinary workers' apartment building, Li Minghua carefully taught her granddaughter the classical poetry forms that had been perfected in institutions the revolutionaries had tried to erase from history. The year was 1968, and despite the campaign to eliminate every trace of traditional Chinese culture, knowledge that had survived 2 millennia of political upheavals continued to find ways to persist through the most systematic cultural destruction China had ever experienced. The preservation techniques that had been developed over centuries of intermittent government suppression proved adaptable to the new challenges posed by total ideological control. Knowledge was transmitted through seemingly innocent activities: classical poetry disguised as revolutionary songs, traditional painting techniques taught as industrial design, philosophical concepts embedded in technical discussions about agricultural or manufacturing processes. Family networks that had historical connections to these institutions maintained informal educational activities that preserved cultural knowledge across generational lines. Grandparents would share stories, teach traditional skills, and pass on cultural values to grandchildren who might someday be able to apply this knowledge when political conditions changed. Geographic dispersal of knowledge across different regions of China ensured that local variations of traditional practices could survive even when national campaigns successfully eliminated them in major urban centers. Rural communities, ethnic minority areas, and remote regions often maintained traditional practices that were less visible to government authorities. Professional networks among artists, scholars, and educators provided channels for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge through ostensibly approved activities. Traditional artistic techniques could be maintained through work in government-sponsored cultural organizations, while philosophical and literary knowledge could be preserved through apparently orthodox academic activities. International connections with overseas Chinese communities provided external repositories for cultural knowledge that could be maintained outside the reach of domestic political campaigns. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Chinese communities in other countries served as archives that preserved cultural traditions that were being suppressed in mainland China. Religious institutions, particularly Buddhist and Taoist temples that survived government persecution, sometimes served as repositories for cultural knowledge that had historical connections to the suppressed institutions. Monks and nuns who had received traditional educations before the Communist Revolution could maintain some traditional practices under the cover of religious activities. Literary preservation occurred through memorization of classical texts by individuals who could recite entire works without possessing physical copies that might be discovered and confiscated. Oral transmission of poetry, essays, and other literary works ensured their survival, even when written versions were systematically destroyed. Artistic techniques were preserved through practice in private settings where traditional methods could be maintained without official detection. Painters, calligraphers, musicians, and other artists continued developing their skills using traditional approaches, while publicly conforming to revolutionary artistic requirements. Educational activities were disguised as approved political instruction or technical training, while actually transmitting traditional knowledge to new generations of students. Teachers who possessed traditional education could embed classical knowledge within apparently orthodox curriculum content. Commercial knowledge survived through private business activities that continued despite official disapproval of private enterprise. Traditional approaches to commerce, finance, and international trade were maintained by individuals who expected that political conditions would eventually change to allow renewed private economic activity. Cultural ceremonies and social practices were maintained in modified forms that appeared to conform to revolutionary requirements, while actually preserving traditional customs. Weddings, funerals, festivals, and other social events continued to incorporate traditional elements that maintained cultural continuity. Philosophical and spiritual practices were adapted to political circumstances, while preserving essential insights that had been developed over centuries of Chinese intellectual development. Traditional approaches to understanding human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual and society continued to influence thinking, even when they couldn't be openly discussed. Regional dialects and linguistic practices preserved cultural knowledge that was embedded in language itself. Traditional poetry, philosophical concepts, and cultural values that were expressed through specific linguistic forms could survive through continued use of traditional language patterns. Women's networks that had historical connections to the suppressed institutions sometimes maintained informal organizations that preserved cultural knowledge specifically related to women's experiences and perspectives. These networks were often less visible to government authorities and could maintain traditional practices more easily than male-dominated organizations. What survived in hiding would eventually help rebuild what had been lost. Professor Wang Zhengming felt his hands shake as he opened the sealed archive box in the basement of Beijing University's library, knowing that the documents inside might require him to completely rewrite the doctoral dissertation he had spent 5 years researching. The year was 1985, and China's new policy of reform and opening had begun to allow scholars access to historical materials that had been suppressed for decades. What he discovered in those yellowed manuscripts would force Chinese intellectuals to confront the reality that their understanding of their own cultural history had been systematically distorted by political campaigns that had eliminated crucial chapters from the story of Chinese civilization. The rehabilitation of suppressed historical topics had begun cautiously, with scholars initially focusing on areas that seemed politically safe: artistic achievements, technological innovations, and cultural exchanges that could be celebrated without challenging current political orthodoxy. But as archives were opened and research restrictions were relaxed, evidence began to emerge that demanded more fundamental reconsideration of Chinese cultural development. Archaeological discoveries at sites in Xi'an, Luoyang, and other historical capitals revealed physical evidence of the sophisticated institutional structures that had supported Chinese cultural development for over a millennium. The architectural remains, artistic artifacts, and preserved documents found at these sites provided material evidence that contradicted official historical narratives that had minimized or eliminated the importance of these institutions. Literary scholarship began to reveal the true extent of cultural suppression. When researchers gained access to private collections that had preserved works excluded from official literary canons, the quality and quantity of literature that had been systematically ignored forced scholars to recognize that their understanding of Chinese literary development had been fundamentally incomplete. Art historical research revealed similar patterns of systematic exclusion, with masterpieces that had been attributed to approved artists or completely ignored being revealed as works created in institutional contexts that official history had denied. The collaborative artistic methods that had produced these works challenged individualistic assumptions about artistic creation that had been imported from Western aesthetic theory. International scholarship began to provide outside perspectives on Chinese cultural history that weren't constrained by domestic political considerations. Researchers in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, and Western countries had maintained access to historical materials and scholarly traditions that provided alternative frameworks for understanding Chinese cultural development. Women's studies emerged as a field that was particularly important for understanding the historical roles that had been systematically erased from official narratives. Female scholars began investigating the lives and achievements of women who had played crucial roles in Chinese cultural development, but whose contributions had been minimized or denied by traditional historiography. Cultural preservation movements began to emerge as Chinese intellectuals recognized that important aspects of their cultural heritage had been lost or damaged during decades of political suppression. Efforts to revive traditional artistic forms, preserve historical sites, and document disappearing cultural practices reflected growing awareness of the value of cultural diversity and historical continuity. Educational reform began to incorporate more comprehensive approaches to Chinese cultural history that acknowledged the complexity and diversity of historical experience. Curriculum changes allowed students to learn about aspects of Chinese civilization that had been excluded from previous educational programs. Artistic revival movements emerged as contemporary Chinese artists began to explore traditional forms and themes that had been suppressed during the revolutionary period. These artistic explorations often involved rediscovering techniques and aesthetic approaches that had been preserved in underground cultural networks. Academic conferences and scholarly publications provided forums for discussing research that challenged official historical narratives These intellectual exchanges allowed scholars to share discoveries, debate interpretations, and gradually build more comprehensive understanding of Chinese cultural history. Popular culture began to reflect growing interest in historical topics that had previously been forbidden or discouraged. Novels, films, television programs, and other forms of popular entertainment began to explore themes and historical periods that represented more diverse perspectives on Chinese experience. International cultural exchange provided opportunities for Chinese scholars and artists to engage with global intellectual communities that had maintained interest in aspects of Chinese culture that had been suppressed domestically. These exchanges facilitated scholarly cooperation and cultural understanding that enriched Chinese intellectual life. Government policy gradually became more supportive of cultural research and preservation activities as officials recognized that cultural heritage could contribute to national development and international prestige. This policy evolution allowed more open discussion of historical topics that had previously been politically sensitive. Museum exhibitions and cultural programs began to present more comprehensive representations of Chinese cultural history that included previously suppressed topics. These public presentations helped educate broader audiences about the complexity and richness of Chinese cultural traditions. The truth that was buried for decades is finally emerging into the light. The conference room in Shanghai's gleaming financial district fell silent as Dr. Chen Mei presented her research on how ancient Chinese cultural institutions had managed to maintain sophisticated international networks across continents long before modern communication technology made such coordination seem possible. The year was 2019, and in an era when global connectivity was taken for granted, scholars were beginning to recognize that their ancestors had achieved levels of cultural, economic and political integration that challenged contemporary assumptions about historical progress and social organization. The educational innovations these institutions had developed offered insights for contemporary approaches to learning that emphasized practical skills, cultural knowledge, and interpersonal capabilities, rather than mere memorization of information. Their integration of classical scholarship with practical training provided models for educational programs that could prepare students for leadership roles in complex, interconnected societies. Economic networks that had operated across vast distances using sophisticated credit instruments, risk-sharing arrangements, and international partnerships provided historical examples of financial innovation that anticipated modern global commerce by centuries. Their approaches to managing complex commercial relationships offered lessons for contemporary efforts to develop more stable and equitable international economic systems. Cultural preservation methods that had maintained traditions through centuries of political upheaval demonstrated approaches to protecting valuable knowledge and practices that could inform contemporary efforts to maintain cultural diversity in an increasingly homogenized global environment. Their techniques for adapting traditional practices to changing circumstances while preserving essential cultural values offered guidance for societies facing rapid social change. Information management systems that had gathered, analyzed, and distributed intelligence across continents provided historical examples of sophisticated approaches to handling complex information flows that anticipated modern challenges in managing global communication networks. Their methods for evaluating source reliability, cross-referencing multiple sources, and synthesizing information to develop actionable insights offered lessons for contemporary efforts to combat misinformation and maintain informed decision-making. International relations conducted through informal diplomatic channels provided historical examples of how cultural exchange, commercial cooperation and personal relationships could maintain peace and stability across different political systems. Their approaches to managing conflict resolution, facilitating cultural exchange, building trust between different communities offered guidance for contemporary diplomatic efforts. Women's leadership in these institutions provided historical examples of how societies could benefit from utilizing the full range of human talent, regardless of gender restrictions. Their achievements in education, arts, politics, and economics demonstrated that gender equality was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for optimal social development. Artistic innovation that had emerged from collaborative creative environments offered models for contemporary efforts to foster creativity and cultural development. Their approaches to supporting artistic experimentation, facilitating collaboration between artists, and integrating different cultural traditions provided guidance for contemporary cultural policies. Social integration methods that had successfully managed diversity within unified cultural frameworks offered lessons for contemporary societies struggling with questions of multiculturalism, social cohesion, and national identity. Their techniques for maintaining cultural unity while respecting individual differences provided models for addressing contemporary social challenges. Technological adaptation that had allowed these institutions to maintain effectiveness across different historical periods demonstrated approaches to managing technological change that preserved valuable social functions while adapting to new capabilities. Their flexibility in adopting new tools while maintaining essential purposes offered guidance for contemporary efforts to manage technological disruption. Psychological understanding that had enabled these institutions to influence human behavior and facilitate social cooperation provided insights into human nature that remained relevant for contemporary efforts to improve social organization, conflict resolution, and community building. Historical perspective offered by studying these institutions challenged contemporary assumptions about social progress, gender relations, and cultural development that could inform more sophisticated approaches to addressing current social challenges. Their achievements demonstrated that progress was not always linear, and that valuable knowledge could be lost as well as gained through historical change. Global connectivity achieved by these institutions provided historical examples of successful international cooperation that could inform contemporary efforts to address global challenges, requiring coordination across different political and cultural systems. Their methods for building trust, sharing resources, and coordinating activities across vast distances offered lessons for contemporary global governance efforts. The survival strategies these institutions had developed for maintaining valuable social functions, despite hostile political environments, provided guidance for contemporary efforts to preserve important social institutions and cultural values during periods of political upheaval or transformation. Ethical frameworks that had guided the operation of these institutions offered insights into how societies could balance individual freedom with social responsibility, competitive dynamics with cooperative relationships, and innovation with tradition in ways that promoted both individual fulfillment and social welfare. Perhaps the greatest secret they kept was how civilization really works, not through force or law, but through the subtle arts of influence, culture, and human connection. The moonlight filters through modern glass towers in Shanghai's financial district, casting shadows that would be familiar to the courtesans who once walked these same streets when they were dirt paths between traditional courtyard houses. In those shadows, the whispers of ancient wisdom continue to echo, carrying knowledge that our ancestors understood, but that we are only beginning to rediscover. That true power flows not through official channels, but through the intricate networks of culture, relationship, and human understanding that connect hearts across continents and centuries. If you found yourself drawn to the hidden currents that really shaped civilization, where power flowed through silk and poetry rather than swords and decrees, subscribe before these forgotten stories fade back into the shadows where they've waited for centuries to be understood for what they truly were.